I'm Vance Bastian here with my co-host S.A. Baz Collins for this week's Written on the Edge, Season 8, Episode 36, Friday Interview. Dun, dun, dun. We'll be talking with C.H. Williams and talking about their books and series. C.H. Williams is a fantasy author and illustrator living in the mid-Atlantic with his husband, a very spunky dog, and two troublesome cats. With a repertoire of character-driven high fantasy novels, his writing couples the darker side of fairy tales with the radiance and joy of queer love. When not causing trouble or spending time doing foundry work with his husband, and I want to ask about that, he can be found walking in the woods and listening to music. Before delving into the realms of magic, he worked as a classical musician, actively performing and conducting research about musicians' relationship to gender. He has since pivoted to legal work during the day and writing dark contemplative fantasy at night. His writing touches on the soft, small moments of magic made when we cultivate our gardens amid the storms, and on the immensity of experience as he explores character-driven stories that play out realistic decisions and consequences of a fantastical universe. CH, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Foundry? I have to ask.
So my husband does metalworking. He's got a small metalworking business, like a micro foundry. So we do like a lot of sand casting. That's often how we spend evenings and weekends, just lighting up the forge and making some art.
That is epic.
It's very cool.
So, amidst the music and the legal work and the foundry work, where was the drive to write?
So
Yeah, and where was the time?
Yeah.
Just gonna go with
it
that.
came primarily after the music. But it's always been there. I mean, I've been a book lover from a very young age. You know, my dad used to read to me often, and that was a very formative experience into fantasy, of course, I think, as it is for a lot of people. Like as I said, so my background is music. I studied viola and composition. And during my time as a composition student, I found myself working a lot on pieces that were either inspired by literature or, as time went on, pieces that required me to actually work with text and narrators or, God forbid, write something myself. I found myself vying for those projects a lot and really grabbing onto the text component. Honestly, a bit more than the music component. And there were a lot of factors that went into me kind of pivoting away from the classical music sphere. But that spark that I felt working with words was a huge driving factor forward.
Fantastic. All right, so let's talk about your series.
Excellent. So Death and the Merchant is, oh gosh. All right, so it's the Merchant series. So the first book is Death and the Merchant, and the second book is Airs in the Ice. They follow Elsie as really she's thrown into this world that time has forgotten. The premise is that she's an ordinary person going about her ordinary life, as so many fantasy stories are, and she's plunged into this world full of magic and wonder, and she sees that it's a lot darker than maybe she would have liked. Her life was perhaps a bit bleak to begin with. And while there's this huge, wide world of magic that's out there waiting for her, there's also incredibly high stakes and some incredibly severe consequences that come with opening that door. So that's the broad pitch for it. That's a series that's fairly dark and gritty. It explores a lot of like intensity of circumstance and emotion, and it tends to be very character driven. It's multi POV, which of course I love. I'm such a sucker for that, so I had to take that on myself. So there's the main quartet, which is Elsie, Fletcher, Teddy, and Sam, and then there's some other sort of ancillary characters that occasionally get a POV as well. But yeah, that's the Merchant series.
Nice. And so, Fireside Tales of Rise and Ruin?
Yeah, so that's a series of short stories. The premise behind those, like you sit down at a fire, around a fire in the summertime, and you're all just kind of like chit-chatting, swapping stories, talking about like the local lore, and you get into this um, sort of like legend mythos type feeling stories of the before. So they're set about 600 years before the Merchant series. And it's supposed to kind of lay the foundation for the world that you're walking into. They're certainly not a prerequisite to the Merchant series, but they
Okay.
certainly expand that universe.
Very nice. So, Souls and Shadow?
One of a Thousand Names. So that's the only book that's out in that series right now. And I know a lot of people don't like to start a series before all of them are done. But too bad here. Gonna have to just deal with it, I suppose. So One of a Thousand Names, I think, is perhaps my favorite out of all of them, at least for right now. I'm in my garden era. And it follows Rose as she sets out to avenge the death of her father. That takes place before the short stories. So it lays the groundwork for this huge war that's happening. Then we get the Fireside Tales of Rise and Ruin, and then we get the Merchant series. So you get a nice little chronology. You don't have to read them in any particular order, although I am a fan of recommending Death and the Merchant, One of a Thousand Names, and then Airs in the Ice tends to be my go-to recommendation.
Nice.
So a nice convoluted web of canon.
So, what is your writing process? I mean, obviously, I can feel some of the, fantasy tales slash fairy tales that may have inspired some of these, maybe, especially some of the names you've given your characters. How do you take that and craft it into your story?
So it really depends on the book. So for Death and the Merchant, I just started writing and then editing and then having other people edit and then doing a bunch more writing. And really, it was just like rinse and repeat for that for a couple of years of just trying to figure out how much outlining I need to do, how much I needed to just pants it. I think in part because it's multi POV, it was just very organic and depending on how much time I had and where I was at personally and what I needed in terms of organizational structure, it was quite varied. One of a Thousand Names, though, is my favorite book to talk about in terms of the process. So,
Really?
so it was written aleatorically, which means by chance. The entire structure was determined through a chance process. This was a carryover from my days in music. This was one of my favorite methods of writing music as well. So before I started the book, I sat down and I made a list of, I think it was 100 different plants. And
Wow.
I I went on Wikipedia and just like picked whatever sounded cool. I love plants. I love gardening. That's a huge part of my life. And so just reading through, picking things that sounded interesting, and I would take notes about each plant, about either the growth habit or how it's cultivated, or if there's like a symbolic meaning in art, anything that really jumped out to me as being meaningful.
Hmm.
And then I just got out the random number generator and started going. So it started, the first chapter that I rolled was Rose. So that was the main character's name was it was going to be Rose. And um, she talks about having thorns. That was going to be the introduction. For the first chapter, she introduces herself as I am my name is Rose, and if you touch me, you will bleed. She talks about these thorns, and so on for each chapter. I wanted each plant to inform where the plot went, whether it was, some kind of medicinal thing that a character picked up, or whether there was a symbolism at play, or whether it was the landscape around them, or whether it was, anything that was plant related. I wanted that to drive where the plot was going. I knew broad strokes what I wanted the story to be, and I knew sort of the main points that I wanted to hit, the main places I wanted them to go, but I really wanted that to be determined by what plant got rolled for that particular chapter.
So, was that method a challenge or an inspiration?
I felt like it was an inspiration.
Nice.
I found that the flow came very easily, having some structure, but not too much.
Hmm.
It really hit that sweet spot of, I can have these complicated ideas and I can just write. I'm not really constrained by an outline, which is something I run into a lot is I got the outline and then I do something entirely different. It's like the same person did not write these two things. So I found it very freeing. It was just enough structure so I didn't ever feel lost or like I had hit a wall or anything, but enough freedom to just do what I wanted.
Perfect. So, what has your experience been like as a queer author in the fantasy realm, i.e., genre?
Um, you mean like for me personally, like interacting in like as a book writer seller?
A little bit of both, what you've seen for others as well as your own experience.
Yeah, so it's been weird walking in both the worlds of queerness and fantasy. Both of those manifest in such different ways for every person. And so, right off the bat, you're dealing with a huge spectrum for both of those things. For me, I love nuance. And I think that is a driving factor for me, both as a queer author and as someone who writes queer fantasy books. I used to put a label on it like quiet queerness or something like that, something in that vein, but I don't think that's really accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I would obsessively catalog each time like a gay character interacted in the books I was reading, each time like they hugged or they brushed a kiss on each other's cheek or held hands or whatever. And I, for a long time, felt like those were just very quiet gestures because no one else seemed to care about them. But I cared like a lot, like obsessively cared about them because they weren't quiet for me.
Mm-hmm.
Those were immensely profound gestures that made me feel eager and excited and emboldened to just like be myself as like a trans gay man. So, and that's like a huge thing. That's a
Mm-hmm.
huge thing. And I don't know, like if that doesn't have a place in fantasy, like if something that makes a person feel powerful and bold doesn't have a place in a story about like magic and heroes and villains, then like I don't know what does.
Right.
So like that I think was the opening premise for I don't know, engaging with writing as a queer person was okay, I have these things, this thing, I have these feelings, I have this catalog of things I want to see in books that make me feel so powerful. And like, I love fantasy. So, okay, here we go. You know,
Nice.
uh,
So, you're also a rep.
yes.
You
So,
hesitated.
He says
Uh-oh.
hesitantly, yeah.
yeah,
The
I mean,
wall
I don't know.
rises.
I always have mixed feelings about that. And I'd like to think that that's fairly prevalent, but I suspect that it may be more just me. Um, I don't know. I think there's always like a little bit of imposter syndrome that kind of creeps
Mm,
in of like, well, am I like enough? Am I doing it enough for other people? Which doesn't matter. That's not a good metric. No one should use that.
nope.
That went off for anyone. They should just disregard that. But I don't know. Like I think I also have kind of a complicated relationship with labels and I don't know, like I've periodically had people reach out and say like, "Oh, can I tag you as this or that in this catalog or like this list of diverse authors or whatever?" And that also feels very weird to me. But on the flip side, like there's definitely something that hits different when you read work written by a queer author. So I get it.
Hmm.
But my knee jerk towards a checkbox tends to just be a little complicated, I think, for better or worse.
Right. No, that's fair. I know that when I was young, and we're talking back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I was
Ah,
actually proud to be click. I know you're older than me, but I was
I
proud
was
to
saying,
be
girl,
included
don't go there.
in those numbers because back then it mattered. It mattered that we had the numbers to show.
Just for clarity's
Yeah,
sake,
it's
Vance was around when black and white was in vogue. I was with the dinosaurs. Just to put in proper perspective.
gosh. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's cool to be able to like go to book events and like put the trans pride flag, on the table and have people come up and that connects with them and that sparks something for them and we can have a great conversation. I think it's also very scary because I always want to qualify it very heavily and say, oh no, like this is just me. Like these books, they're just me. They don't have to be anything else. Like don't put anything else on them. It's what I needed at the time and my God, people need such different things, and people are so varied, especially when it comes to queerness about what's going to hit good for them, and especially when you're trying to figure yourself out. Like, I think it's just, I'm always very aware, like I don't ever want any of those readers to think like I'm trying to tell them how to be or what to do, and which is not the case. But
Well, you know, I think it's human nature to want to put ourselves in these little boxes, but that's a learned thing. We need to
yeah,
unlearn a lot of that, you know, because we tend to want a shortcut and put people, oh, you're this, oh, you're that, you know, kind of thing.
Mhm.
And that's not really how we're meant to live our lives. And so it's kind of like, I liken it to um, when my granddaughter taught me to use the word queer, because for my generation it was a pejorative. It was something that was really painful and hurtful. However, when she taught me that it was actually freeing, because then you don't need to specify where in the queer spectrum you fall in, you then begin to realize that we're not a monolith. Every journey is going to be unique and different. And while we may have common experiences, you're not always going to have a character or a person who reacts in the same way because of their own life experiences and because of what's gone on either traumatically or jubilantly in their lives that have brought them to that moment when they have that encounter of that situation or whatever we're putting them through. So I always tend to take those readers or those writers with a grain of salt, because when they try to be specific and make those kinds of classifications so narrow, because life's not like that. Life is messy. Life is very, very messy. And I think our writing should reflect that, don't you?
well, I love that intersection too, and like that's one of the joys I think of being a queer author is trying to capture that and trying to hold on to like dark and gritty feelings. Broadly, one of my main feelings is like trying to hold on to stuff that's like not just run of the mill anti-queerness, and like letting queer characters be big, whole, messy people with like these massive lives outside of, what one person might just see as a small checkbox,
And
like,
and I just think also,
yeah.
you know, to your point there, I just had a sudden thought. It's weird how, as I said, in my generation, queer and even Vance's queer was a very hurtful and painful word. And yet we're finding in amongst our community that queer is probably the most powerful word we can use, and how mainstream tried to take that power away from us. But by embracing it, we can wield much more power and include many more people in our community because we're not so narrowly defining it. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the word that I think I've gravitated to the most. Like it's such a beautiful umbrella. And especially, when I was a younger queer person trying to sort out my place in the world and my place with myself, like the need to hyper categorize myself was, very much an external pressure. And once I could just say look, my relationship with who I am is a private, personal thing.
Mm-hmm.
And all you need to know is that I'm queer. And like that's good enough. And if I want to talk about the nuance, because Lord knows that I love talking about the nuance of some of this stuff, then we'll get into it. But it's not a
But that's what
requirement
makes
and
your
it's not
stories
enough.
unique. That's what makes them unique,
Mhm.
is the nuances are what we should talk about, not the
Uh,
classification in itself. You know what I mean?
Right.
100%. Like, and I love that, particularly in Death and the Merchant, like that, the nuance of queerness. So like
Mm.
Teddy, for example, who is one of the four main characters. I think he's just such a great example of this sort of nuanced subtextual complexity because it's not often called out in the text, but there's a lot that's there. So, for some background, so he's a trans man and he's also a healer in the book, and there's space for him in these books to deal with the expectations that are put on him as a caretaker, both for his sister and his family, and he gets to grapple with. Well, I don't know if he gets to, but he does grapple with having magic that allows him to fix other people, but he also has to deal with expectations from a dysfunctional family and a dysfunctional culture that says he can't be anything more than the person who fixes everyone's problems. And like any trans man who was assigned eldest daughter at birth is going to know that feeling. Like that's a very niche feeling, but like that's a complicated, messy feeling that it has some inherent queerness to it, but has a lot of other things and shows a much bigger picture too. And Yeah, I love that. I love the space to ruminate over nuanced and complicated
Hmm.
and realistic feelings. Like it just,
Hmm.
oh gosh, I was craving that for so long. And, especially at the time that I started writing this, it was very, very hard to find that.
Preach, Brother Williams. That's all I'll say.
Is there anything else about your works, your process, anything you want to discuss that we didn't ask?
Uh, well, we got on my I love nuance of being queer soapbox, so that's the big checkbox for me. And we got the messy web of how these are all interconnected on the timeline,
Hmm.
which is also on my website for people that didn't want to follow that.
I'll admit that's where I learned. So, what's up next for you?
So right now, I am in the final stages of getting the third book in the Merchant series together. So
Ooh.
means people should be watching for a fun announcement here shortly. I also like to remind people it's a great time to go read the first two books because like they're kind of hefty. Got Ears in the Ice. It's a
Oof.
chomper. So
Nice.
like 500-ish pages each. So you got some time to go read those. You can really just, cruise through it. There's
Girl,
an
you write
audiobook
like I do. my
for
my husband always comments and says when they say, "Oh, I have a 200-page novel out," and my husband always murmurs under his breath, "Well, that's his first chapter."
look, if you've got the words, use
Yeah,
them. I have
yeah,
tried,
I
and I
agree.
have shorter stuff. I do have shorter stuff. People can go check out Festival of Frost and Storm of Ascension and Carnival of Clouds if they're into that. That's totally great. I have to fight to keep that word count down. And it's
I
serious.
get it.
And no rules here. We make our own rules. We're just gonna
That's right.
write.
There you go. That's
Dagger is
right.
shaping up to be the longest of the three. So if that excites you, then I have some great news.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a great time to go check those out. There's an audiobook for Death and the Merchant, if that's more your jam. And then also just, One of a Thousand Names. There's also an audiobook for that if you want to catch all of the fun Easter eggs that are in the ice, and that will be in the third book as well that reference back to that, which I personally love. It makes me feel very smart to go find those things in other people's work.
Nice.
Excellent.
All right. Well, you teased that people should pay attention for an announcement. Where's the best place to follow you?
So I have a newsletter, and I promise I only send out very important emails. So you're not going to get spammed with anything. So you can go to chwilliamsliterary.com and sign up for that. It's going to be right on the front page. If you do that, you can download a free copy of Festival of Frost.
I was going to say you should mention that.
Yep. So who doesn't love free books? Everyone's favorite thing. So you can get information about that. You can also find me on Instagram. There's a Twitter account out there still. It's not particularly active, but go for it. I occasionally will put important stuff out there. I remember it exists.
Well,
Instagram really is going to be the best place.
That's what we
Sorry
need.
for everyone else who uses something else, but
that's the answer we needed right there. All right. Any final words of wisdom?
no. Wisdom? No.
Oh, come on now, old soul.
You should just write what you want. That's always my stock advice. It's just
Perfect.
you should just write what you want because it's going to be amazing.
Perfect.
No.
All right, folks. We'd like to extend a huge thank you to C.H. Williams for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for having me.
Our pleasure. We at Written on the Edge are proud to introduce you to new media by queer content creators, so if you enjoy learning about new artists like C.H. Williams, or hearing our thoughts on entertainment media, please like and subscribe so you get the alerts for new episodes. The show was produced by Real Ravens Media. For our disclaimers, links to social media, our listen stations, or to sign up as a guest, visit www.rotepodcast.com. Tune in next week for your queer media fix.
Bye.
Oh, what's that? Closing time. The bums rush in melody, dear.